Olá, daqui é a Margarida do Fumaça. Primeiro, duas novidades, fazes parte da comunidade Fumaça. Este mês os eventos estão de volta. A 23 de setembro há um Ask Me Anything sobre a exploração de lítio em Portugal. Vamos olhar para Covas do Barroso, em Boticas, no Alto Tâmega. A nossa convidada, Aida Fernandes, é lá moradora e presidente da comunidade de Baldios. Podes vir colocar-lhe as tuas perguntas via Zoom a partir das 9 da noite, dia 23 de setembro. E uns dias depois, a 27 de setembro, há a visita à redação. Das 6 da tarde às 8 da noite, podes vir conhecer o nosso cantinho em Lisboa, conversar com a equipa e outros membros da comunidade de Fumaça. Basta teres uma contribuição mensal ativa. Se ainda não fazes parte, vai a fumaca.pt/contribuir e considera juntar-te. Agora sim, sobre esta entrevista. Há um episódio do podcast Love and Radio em que pensamos muito ao preparar esta entrevista. Chama-se Refraction. É sobre uma mulher e um homem na faculdade. Durante algum tempo, ela chama ao que ele lhe fez um mau engate. Depois apercebe-se de que foi uma agressão sexual. Ela descreve assim o que se passou a seguir. Eu queria chamá-lo a atenção, mas eu queria que ele fosse capaz de se chegar à frente por si próprio. Queria que ele pudesse estar ali comigo e contar a história comigo e que a história fosse exposta de uma forma que não nos colocasse nas categorias de angelicais sobreviventes puros ou horríveis agressores malvados. Eu não queria um processo formal, não queria que fosse dado um verdito. Eu queria que houvesse uma discussão e que eu decidisse com ele quais seriam os resultados. Isto, diz ela, é uma prática de justiça restaurativa, aquela que ela, como vítima, precisava. A justiça restaurativa é uma forma de reparar danos em caso de conflito ou crime. Rebecca Banwell-Moore, que vais ouvir de seguida, explica em termos mais concretos o que isto significa. Formada em criminologia, é investigadora na Universidade de Nottingham, em Inglaterra. Na tese de doutoramento, estudou o que impede e o que facilita o acesso de vítimas a processos de justiça restaurativa. E porquê é que a teoria está às vezes tão distante da prática? Esta entrevista é feita em inglês e soa melhor se ouvis com os escutadores. Faz parte da longa e demorada série sobre prisões em que estamos a trabalhar. O atual esqueleto tem 12 episódios. Um dia, daqui a ainda muitos dias, estará disponível para ouvires. Até lá, fica com a entrevista. Restorative justice isn't an American or European idea from the 70s. In fact, emerged as a confluence of African and North American indigenous practice to solve conflicts. It has been gaining importance since inside the Western penal systems in response to the criticism that current retributive and punitive justice fails both victims and offenders. Can you explain how restorative justice became this important current to reform the Western penal systems?
I think it emerged as a justice process, sort of, as you say, sort of back in the 70s, and was being used in sort of an ad hoc way, sort of grassroots movement. And there was lots of pilots happening in sort of the late 70s and 80s. But we're also at a point where, as we were coming into the late 80s and 1990s, that we were seeing crime levels going up, and then this kind of view that nothing works. What can we do? Because actually we've got crime levels going up, especially sort of focusing on youth justice, because that's where restorative justice was first kind of implemented in terms of legislation within the criminal justice system, was actually that something needs to change. And it was about how do we encourage people to take responsibility, and how can we also give victims sort of their not their day in court, but actually how do we put them at the heart of the criminal justice system? Because if we don't have victims coming forward and reporting crimes and being witnesses, then the criminal justice system just falls apart, and justice as a whole falls apart. So we need victims to have trust in the criminal justice system and to see it as a legitimate process. And we were seeing a lot of sort of attrition rates and victims feeling that they were not being heard. Mm-hmm. at the same time as sort of crime levels rising. So it was introduced in England and Wales within the Crime and Disorder Act 1998, and then the Youth Crime and Evidence Act in 1999, which established the youth offending teams. Mm-hmm. So it's an overhaul of how we were actually going to deal with youth justice. And that was when restorative principles were introduced into the youth justice system, so that actually youth justice would be based on restorative principles.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that in England and Wales, all victims, regardless of the offence that was committed or the age of the offender, have to be in any stage of the process given the right and given the information on restorative justice practice.
Yeah.
In practice, what happens? Can you explain a little bit?
So in practice, we have a victims code of practice, and that introduced restorative justice within that victims code of practice in 2015, coming out of the Council of Europe's recommendations that restorative justice should be a justice process that all victims are offered or have the opportunity to participate in. So in principle, all statutory organisations, so police, courts, probation, etc., they're statutorily obligated to offer the victim the opportunity to participate in restorative justice, or to give them information on it and how they can participate. And that's where my PhD thesis kind of emerged from, to say, well, actually what we have is we have this guidance saying that all victims should be offered restorative justice. And actually then what's happening in practice is that very few victims actually get the opportunity to participate in restorative justice. So I wanted to understand, where's this disparity? What are the sort of enablers and the barriers to victim participating in restorative justice? So the big barriers are that actually victims just are not being offered it. So criminal justice professionals see it as an optional extra.
Do you think that happens because people don't believe it works, or they don't? For instance, is there solid studies demonstrating the effectiveness of the
Yes,
system?
so my PhD supervisor, Professor Joanna Shapland, headed up a £7 million Home Office funded pilot of restorative justice, which commenced in 2001 and ran until 2004. And the last valuation report was published in 2008. And that was the first piece of research that looked at the feasibility, the possibility of using restorative justice with adult offenders and for serious offences. Because, as I say before, it had predominantly been used within youth justice and for low-level crimes, so crimes that actually could have been dealt with out of court, but they could be dealt with through restorative justice. So Joanna Shapland's Home Office study looked at it for violent and serious offences and found that actually it could reduce reoffending rates by 14%. And for every £1 that is spent on restorative justice, there's a £9 saving to the criminal justice system. So there is substantial evidence there that shows that actually it works for serious crimes, and it also has a cost-saving benefit to the state.
Do you believe it works for a certain type of crime and not for all crimes? So
no, I think it can work for all crimes, and actually that's where we talk about the harm and the impact that that crime has had, because in my study I interviewed 25 victims. 5 of them didn't actually take part in restorative justice, so I wanted to understand, why did you not take part? And those victims have been victims of either a burglary, car theft, assault, right up to attempted murder and rape. What I'm trying to say is that the offence didn't actually matter. It was the impact that it had. So I had a young guy who had been assaulted on a night out in a nightclub. He had been left with a bleed on his brain and he had been hospitalised. And when I asked him why he didn't want to take part in restorative justice, he said because it wasn't anything, it was too trivial. And then when I asked the lady who had been raped and her partner had tried to kill her as well, why she wanted to take part in restorative justice, is because she had answers, and actually for her it was empowering. And that is one of the benefits as well about restorative justice, is that it's giving victims back that power. Because as soon as they report the crime and they make a statement, they're kind of on this conveyor belt through the criminal justice system where they don't have any say in what happens next. They have no say in those procedural processes or outcomes. So it really doesn't matter about the offence type. And there's always been this conversation about, not conversation, but sort of conflict, and saying, well, is it okay to use it in sexual offences or domestic violence? And there is so much evidence base now that says, yes, it is. Of course, you need to manage the risks. But those risks can, to an extent, be mitigated. Of course, we need to take into account, well, actually, is there coercive control going on there? Is there a history of domestic violence? And all of these factors need to be considered because each case is unique. So what we should be doing is not ruling restorative justice out per se and saying, oh, well, actually, there's a blanket ban. And that's what we found here in England and Wales, in that actually there are some police forces that have a blanket ban on using restorative justice for those types of offences.
Because people do the correlation of restorative justice and forgiveness. For instance, I wanted to read you a quote from Fania E. Davis. She's an American scholar, activist, and social rights attorney.
Yeah.
I think one of the main voices for restorative practice in the US.
Yes.
And she defined it as a justice that seeks not to punish, but to heal, a justice that is not about getting even, but about getting well, a justice that seeks to transform broken lives, relationships, and communities rather than damage them further. How do you deconstruct when people say that, that restorative justice is a process to find forgiveness from the victim to the offender?
It isn't about finding forgiveness, but it is sort of a process of empathy in a way. It's about understanding the other person's perspective, what led to that person committing that offence, and also for that person that's committed, that caused that harm, to understand the impact that that has had. And actually, it's probably the first time for the person that's harmed to actually hear from the victim's perspective the impact that their behaviour has had. And if we shame people, then actually we can use what's Braithwaite would term as reintegrative shaming. That yes, that person has to be shamed to an extent, but actually it's about reintegrating them back into society, because the more that you ostracise somebody, then the more likely they are to reoffend.
But coming clean about your crime and publicly doing so, there's an element of shame in that as well.
There is an element of shame in that, yes. We're not saying go and stand somebody on a corner with a billboard that says, I'm a criminal, or for us, sort of 10 years ago in probation, we had sort of a payback system where people go, and they still do go out and do community hours as sort of reparation, but you cannot put a high-vis jacket on one of those people saying community payback, you're labelling them, whereas actually what we need to do is say, okay, what has happened? What do you need to do to be a better person? How can we help you? So it's actually one of the sort of thinking about the social discipline window is actually restorative justice does things with people rather than for or to. It's about doing it with that person and allowing that we had this real issue of this sort of dichotomy of zero-sum victim-offender. But actually, if we look at the offender population, if we look at the prison population, then we know that 50% of offenders say that they have a mental health issue. If we look at all the adverse childhood experiences, educational exclusion, chaotic lifestyles, we have a care home to prison pipeline where actually a huge majority of those young people that have been in the care system end up in prison. So these people are to some extent a victim. And unless we help them to see themselves as worthy people, then we need to rehabilitate them, but we also need to reintegrate them. And it's about giving those people some sense of dignity and self-worth. And the prison system does not do that whatsoever. So taking part in restorative justice gives people a sense of making amends. It is about making amends, that person can, as I say, either symbolically by saying, I'm sorry, or I didn't understand, I had no idea that what I did would have that impact, that you still wouldn't be able to sleep for nights. And the lady who took part in my study, the lady who had been raped and her partner had tried to then kill her, had been trying to take part in restorative justice for 11 years. And she was blocked at every single stage because criminal justice professionals are very protective. So they're either protective of their victim, because they think that they know, but quite well-meaning, but they think they know what is right for their victim. And they say, no, you're not at the right stage. This is too painful for you. Or the offender is not at the right stage. He hasn't shown any remorse. But remorse is an emergent sort of process, that happens as you go through the process of restorative justice, when it's that, what we call that kind of light bulb moment when the harmer suddenly says, wow.
I haven't realised.
Yeah. And at no point through the criminal justice process does the harmer have to listen to the victim.
Do you think that current systems just expect people to arrive at that point, to the person that did some harm, to alone or with counseling arrive at that point of realizing I did feel remorse, but not being helped to reach that point?
Yes, because I think remorse is something that takes a long time. Some people can be remorseful straight away. If they've acted in a rage and they're able to understand and have that emotional intelligence, or for whatever reason they have remorse immediately. Others, that can take a long time. I worked in the youth offending team and I had a young lad who was about 15, 16, who I did some restorative work with. And said, we're going to do some restorative work. We're not going to get, not restorative justice, because I'm not expecting you to meet your victim. This is not what this is about, but we're going to think about the victim, that victim awareness, which then leads on to then potentially a restorative intervention. And when I said to him, how do you think that young person might feel? You've assaulted him. He had to go to hospital. He had stitches to his face. And then he had to come back to school the next day. And he said, I don't feel any fucking way. Basically, that was his words. It's just a cut on his head. Basically, what the hell is a cut? To him, it was nothing, because he said, put yourself in my shoes. I've had far worse than that. You haven't seen what my stepfather has done to me my whole life. So you have to deal with that trauma in a way. You have to see you have to see things as a whole, take a holistic approach to it, and say that person. I mean, some people commit crimes just for the sake of it, or they've got an addiction. Well, okay, let's deal with the addiction. Let's have a restorative approaches. We take a more sort of broader
to people and not to their specific.
It's actually
behavior.
Looking at what made you do that. What was going on? how did you feel at the time?
Mhm.
What do you need for that not to happen again? And how might that feel
Mhm.
or look like?
Is it hard for people to be totally honest during the process?
Yes, but I think that's why, yes, some for some. And that is why restorative justice has to be delivered by trained facilitators. And I think that's where sometimes criminal justice professionals have this barrier to offering it because they feel like they don't have the confidence. In my study, across all those criminal justice professionals, there's 89 professionals, and one of the big themes that came out of it was we haven't got the confidence or we don't know enough about it.
Mm-hmm.
And they would only offer it to what they to individuals that they saw as ideal restorative justice victims. So victims that didn't shout too much and say, do I want to speak to him? Yes, I bloody do want to speak to him, because if I get my hands on him, I'm going to kill him. But there's nothing wrong with anger. Or if victims were far too upset, it'd be like, oh, we won't offer it to them because they're too upset. They can't cope with it. But a victim's pain, there's literature that shows there's literature that shows that a victim's pain, you shouldn't be taking that as a snapshot. That's just a moment in time. We shouldn't take that frozen kind of perspective and go, well, that because pain changes. It has its ebbs and its flows, doesn't it? Like grief and trauma. So offering restorative justice to a victim once and then say, well, they said no, and then never offering it to them again is wrong as well.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes they say, well, we sort of mentioned it and they weren't interested.
Good. So, yeah, that's it. Many of the prison staff that we have been interviewing for this series firmly believe in the power of prisons' dissociative effect, saying that people who are terrified of the consequences of their actions commit fewer offenses. Does restorative justice, as you view it, address this notion or reject it?
I think it would reject it. And I think that actually, as a society, a famous philosopher, and his name has gone out of my head, says that actually you should judge a society on the state of its prisons. And how can we expect prisoners to take responsibility or to change or to desist when we treat them as non-humans? It's the way that we treat them is inhumane.
Because we see them as different.
We see them as different, and we see them as an other, and therefore they're not worthy of being treated with respect or treated with dignity. But actually, if you treat somebody like that, then you label them as unworthy. How can they ever? Well, it's very hard for them to actually make that change, to transform into what they actually want to be.
Mm-hmm.
And most people want to be decent, law-abiding citizens, but that takes support, time, and giving that person the tools that they need to make that change.
Mm-hmm.
And I think at the moment our prison system is very much focused on punishment. We have prisoners who spend more and more time in their cells than they ever have. Our prisons are overcrowded. They're crumbling. And we have high levels of reoffending.
Mm-hmm.
So the system doesn't work. We're spending in England and Wales something like £5.5 to £6 billion a year on our prison system. Yet 70% of offenders will come out and reoffend within the first 12 months. Then that says that is a system that isn't broken. It's completely broken. It's absolutely, I think it's awful. I think it's an awful way to treat people, and it's a complete waste of taxpayers' money. Because when you ask victims what do they want, most victims will say, I want justice. When you ask what does justice look like, then justice actually looks like, I don't want anybody else to go through what I have been through. Mm-hmm. I don't want that person to do this again. I want this person to get the help that they actually need.
But this always goes back to the idea we collectively have as a society that people have to be punished or suffer the consequences of their actions. I think speaking to many people that work in prisons or they surround prisons, even if they are very progressive on their views, I sense that a lot of people still resonate with this idea that there's have to be some kind of punishment. They don't truly believe in the idea of a restorative or rehabilitational system. They always rely on the word punish,
because there's very little rehabilitative work that goes on in the prison. And when you have prisoners that are locked up for 22 hours of the day, you have staffing shortages. So here in England and Wales, and since about 2012, when Chris Grayling did his benchmarking, then we had our staffing levels absolutely cut. So staffing levels are now 26% lower than they were over a decade ago. It's no coincidence, the Ministry of Justice knows this, the government knows, it's no coincidence that we have had severe cuts to the prison system service, including staffing levels. We've hemorrhaged staff, so staff retention is very low. How do you get that power? Because there's only one of you, and you might be responsible for a whole wing of 250. Somehow you need to manage that wing. So inexperienced staff will resort to use of force. Mm-hmm. We look at the levels of incapacity spray, the PAV spray, and where that's being used, then actually it's being used in situations where it should not be used, but as a first sort of port of call, because it's a way of control. However, what you have then is this kind of it just escalates prisoner violence, because in prisons where prisoners feel they have a voice and that they are heard and that they feel that actually they are treated with humanity, and they say that there's good staff-prisoner relations are absolutely key to reducing levels of prisoner violence.
Addressing another, I think, common criticism. Critics say that restorative justice is sweet and benevolent and ready-made justice for privileged offenders, allowing them to avoid a trial or a prison sentence, often by paying a compensation to the victim. I wanted to ask you, is it? And also if there's a restorative approach to dissuasion of crime and to prevention of crime.
So in terms of compensation...
And being sweet, I think...
Here in England and Wales, it's not an option to pay compensation before, as a way of getting out of the court process. Yeah. And some will say, well, actually, some cynics will say that offenders will agree to take part in a restorative justice process pre-trial, so pre-court, because they will see that actually it might get them a lesser sentence, or it will get them a community order rather than a custodial sentence. And maybe that is the case. I mean, there's a really good case of, an example here is a guy called Peter Wolf, and he took part in the Restorative Justice Home Office funded prison project that I told you about back in the early 2000s. He was one of the first prolific offenders to take part in the process. And he said, I only went along with it because it was an excuse to get out of my prison cell and get some chocolate biscuits. However, going through with the process literally turned, he hasn't drunk since, and he hasn't committed any crime since. And he came from a family of prolific offenders for very serious offences. And he said it was for the first time I came face to face with one of my victims, and I had to see and hear the impact that my offending has. Because for me, it was just another day in the office. Oh, well, I've been caught and I've been banged up again. Oh, well, I've got,
That's my life.
yeah, that's my life.
That's what I
How
do.
do I get out of this? So I think in terms of compensation, then that isn't something that really... I think for some victims, they would like financial compensation. For others, then it's more of sort of symbolic compensation, and it could be that, if you've graffitied somewhere or you've assaulted me, then I want you to go on a head injury awareness course, or I'd like you to come and do some gardening for me because you've trashed, caused criminal damage. So I think that, and that's one of the reasons also, one of the barriers to criminal justice professionals offering it sort of pre-court, because they think that victims will see that as the offender trying to get out of taking responsibility. However, yes, it could be that it's a mitigating factor, and the judge can take that into account when he's thinking about what sentence to give. But the flip side of that is that, as I said, that when somebody actually takes part in the restorative justice process, even if they're doing it because they think, oh, actually, this will put me in a good light, it'll be seen favourably. If they go through that process, then because it's a transformative process, that's where the remorse might then come in, or somebody then actually taking responsibility. Because we put a lot of emphasis on the person that's caused the harm must take responsibility. They don't have to take full responsibility. They could just say, yes, I'm guilty. They might have a ton of excuses as to why they've done it, but as long as they've admitted guilt, then they can take part in that process. And if you're saying to the victim, and that's through that preparation, look, this offender has not taken any responsibility. How is that going to be if you speak to him or her and they haven't taken any responsibility? Then that's down then to the victim to decide whether it is a process that they still want to carry on. But even offering a victim the opportunity to have restorative justice is empowering, because it's giving them, it's including them in the decision-making process. So people think, oh, they must meet that person face to face. But actually, being offered it and having a conversation with a restorative justice facilitator, for some victims, that's enough, because they said, somebody has heard my story. And that will get taken into account when it gets to the court process, or it might not, but somebody has heard my story.
The way you're describing is always something that happens alongside or inside the judicial system, the system that we have. It's something that goes alongside it, and not that substitutes. Because also many people have that perception that
and it can be used as a substitute. Obviously, if it's for a more sort of minor offence that is not going to go to court, then it can be used as an out-of-court disposal, and it is used as an out-of-court disposal. So it can be attached to a caution, or they can take part in a restorative justice process. And it can also be done as what we class as street RJ, where an altercation has happened on the street, the police have been involved, and the police can do a little bit of shuttle restorative justice work. What we have to remember is that it's not restorative justice unless the victim's voice and their wishes have been taken into account. So sometimes a police officer will say, well, I did street RJ. And quite a few police evaluations of RJ have said, okay, so what did that entail? Well, I spoke to the perpetrator and I said, how do you think the victim might feel? Do you not think that you better go and give them an apology? But actually nobody's spoken to the victim, so that is not restorative. How can it be restorative?
And do you think there are restorative justice not justice, but practice approaches to prevention of crime.
Absolutely. So what we've seen now here in England and Wales is sort of the embedding of restorative approaches within the education system. And we must remember that we have this education to prison pipeline, and that educational exclusion, if the children that are excluded from school, they are more likely to end up in the criminal justice system and are more likely to end up in prison. So there are a number of schools, and I would like to see this really embedded across all schools, that all schools take a restorative approach to conflict. And where schools are doing that, then they are having some really good outcomes. Not just, you have to change the organisational culture. You can't say, oh, well, we just use a little bit of restorative justice in prison for prison-on-prison conflict, or we just use it between pupil and pupil. You have to embed it in the whole culture of that organisation. So if you've got a teacher and a young person that are having an argument, or you've got teacher with another colleague, it has to, or teachers with parents, etc., it has to be embedded in everything that you do. And one of the examples I've got is that it's been embedded in a pupil referral unit, which is here in England is a unit that those children that have been excluded from mainstream school will go to a pupil referral unit. So you see that there's a high level of behaviour issues in those units, a lot of truancy and really low levels of academic achievement. In this pupil referral unit where it's been embedded in Gloucestershire, they have seen a substantial reduction in levels of disruptive and violent conduct. The relationships between the pupils and staff members has improved significantly. Truancy levels have gone down, and those children's reading levels have gone up by 2 years because they've been treated. They've been taught how to deal with conflict, how to manage your anger, how to manage difference, how to be able to talk through, okay, well, this has happened. What's going to happen if you say, right, I'm going to get my own back on him, right, that's it, we're going to go and smash the car up because that teacher's really pissed me off today. It's that escalation. So how do we can use it as a de-escalation tool.
Yeah. I want to go back to something you said about the risks and the re-victimization risks that can be involved in restorative practice. One of the risks is, as you said, the offender dominates or exercises violence or psychological manipulation over the victim. That's also a fear in cases of domestic violence. For instance, that's why in Portugal, public crimes considered the most serious have been excluded for now from the criminal. We only have a criminal mediation system. Do you believe that all offenses can be mediated and can be brought into the restorative practices?
Absolutely. I mean, yes, every offence. And there will be offences, specific, unique cases where it is not suitable or that person is not in the right position. Maybe with some work they might get to that point, but they can take part in some form of restorative justice. As I said, having a restorative conversation or being able to pass the messages on to their perpetrator. But those risks can be mitigated. I think we've become a very risk-averse society. So we're like, can't do that, we can't do that. We need to we need to manage that risk. We can't manage every risk, but you can think, okay, so if there's a risk that we think there's coercive behaviour, then those types of offences will always have two facilitators in that process. And a lot of preparation will be done. So you might actually be talking with lots of other professionals that have worked with those individuals. And it may be that you know what the signals are.
Yeah.
What are the red flags? What are we looking out for? So it's around preparation. And at any point, if you really feel that actually that individual potentially might be being coerced to going through this process, then that process can stop at any time.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that we shouldn't be ruling something out because we feel that actually the offence is too serious. Because there are examples of bereaved family members who have taken part in restorative justice. We have a couple in the UK who do a lot of prison work called Ray and Vi Donovan. And they are parents of their teenage, I think my mate might be like 18, 19 at the time, their son was killed in quite a violent incident, and they have met with the perpetrators, and they got such a lot out of the process. They were able to get that closure. They were able to have that understanding, to ask those questions. Why? And that's the biggest question. Why?
Why me? Yeah.
So why did you do that? And then also there's another one called, really nice young lad called Jacob Dunn, and he did a TEDx talk, and he was on a night out, and at the time he said, I wasn't a nice individual. I just used to fight all the time, every time we were out. We got this call from friends saying it was kicking off at this pub. I went there, I saw this guy who was actually on a night out with his dad. They'd been at the cricket all day. He said, I ran over, I punched him, he fell to the floor, and he died. And since he served a custodial sentence for that, he's met with the parents of the lad that he killed, and they've worked really, they've done intense restorative work together. And the parents actually say, we just want you to do really well in your life. And he said, somebody saying that to me, having some actual belief in me, made me go on and actually change my life. And he went on, he's now done a degree in criminology and does lots of talk. So I think it's that, it's not a one size fits all. It's every individual case should be taken on its own merits.
Mm-hmm. Also, advocates of restorative justice say that restorative justice doesn't try to undermine the protection of already protected legal assets, people's lives, property, but it tends to protect the victim and its needs. How do you think a restorative justice approach is when the victim wants the offender to be punished? For instance, my question is, does restorative justice recognize the legitimacy of an unforgiving victim or a non-perfect victim, as you said earlier? Can that be also a restorative justice process? And can restorative justice respond to that victim in a certain way?
Yes, because that victim may still have questions. And so it doesn't have to be about forgiveness. And actually that victim or the crime is that serious that, yes, of course, the perpetrator should serve a custodial sentence for that, if it is that serious. But the restorative approach, using restorative justice as an approach that runs sort of complementary to that, does still give that victim the opportunity to have their voice heard, to have their needs met. Because their need might be that, yes, that person serves a custodial sentence, but they also want answers to their question.
Do you think sometimes for victims, people feel that it's too much to ask of victims? So they've been through the process and they have been victim of a crime. And I think some people think it's too much to ask them to hold the moral ground and to be able to be in the same room, to be able to have that conversation. You also addressed that a little bit, but
yeah, I think that let's have a look about the principles of restorative justice are built on principles of inclusivity and engagement and giving victims agency and empowering them that they're part of the decision-making process. So it's not for us to decide that person is not ready, or is not in the right place, or is not suitable, it is for us, as it states in the Victims Code of Practice, that every victim now has the right, it's a right to be given information on how they can access restorative justice and how they can participate. And actually, it's for them to make that decision as to whether that is something that they wish to do in some form or another. It isn't for everybody. And some people say, no, I've got no interest. I'm absolutely fine, because for some people, it hasn't really had that much of an impact. And for others, it's to say, no, I'm not. It's not the right time now.
And some people want to delegate that function, or to say, let the judge handle it. I don't want to be part of it.
Yes. Yeah, of course. But actually, everybody has the right to have that option. And some victims will say that there's some victims in my study who were offered restorative justice pre-court, or actually at the end of the court process, declined, or just said, actually, it's not the right time. And one said to me, it wasn't the right time then, but actually 3 months down the line, a few months down the line, when it all settled, that's when I wanted to take part. So I went and initiated the restorative justice sort of referral myself. I self-referred. For the lady who had been raped and her partner had tried to kill her, then it was, as I said, it was something she had asked for 11 years and been told, no, this cannot happen. This is too serious. He's not in the right place. You're not in the right place. When she pressed and pressed for it, wasn't that she didn't want him to be in prison because he was serving a custodial sentence, but she also knew that at some point he was going to be released. And I think that it can help people to manage that process. So actually they are meant to be offered it by the probation service. And for that specific victim, she said that after 11 years of asking, when she eventually took part in that process, for the first time, she was actually able to go to bed, sleep all night, and she hadn't checked her windows and doors 10 times before she went to bed. And that was the first time in 11, 12 years. Because you've got those answers. You've kind of, in a way, I don't like the word closure, because you can never, for some people, you can never have closure, but it's an element of closure, that you've got an understanding. Or for some people that they've been able to put a face to a name and say, yeah, that's what that person looked like. That person that assaulted me, or that person that raped me, I had this monster in my head. And there are other rape victims that have spoken about this, that actually I've got this, I visualised him as this monster, as this overpowering person that had all of this control. And actually, when I met them and I saw their face, I just had nothing but sympathy really for them, because I just saw them for the weak, measly individual that they were. So it's about taking back control in a way. It's about empowering individuals to make the decisions that they want.
I wanted to go back to that idea of change and transformation into the person that offended someone else. I really like this sentence from a Portuguese investigator on this topic. She's called Sonia Moreira Reis, and she said that prisoners serving time for property crimes, for instance, have internalized that they were kind of Robin Hood, who takes from the richest. They think that there were no consequences for the victim, that the stolen goods can quickly be replaced by another good, as the story that you mentioned. And this demonstrates the need to humanize the victim. Do you believe in that power and that capacity of promoting inner transformation through restorative justice process?
Absolutely, because I think for the first time, that the offender has to think about it from another person's perspective.
Is that kind of psychotherapy?
it's kind of trauma. It's taking a trauma-informed approach. It's taking sort of a therapeutic-based approach. But it isn't therapy.
Yeah.
But it might actually, I think that is it, is like saying that when restorative justice is done, what does that person need? What are the needs? Because we can't just do restorative justice and leave victims and offenders to just get on with it and go, oh, there you go, we've done this piece of work.
We fixed
Off you go, because actually they probably need to be signposted to other agencies to make sure that they've got the support. And actually, if we have prisoners that are taking part in a restorative justice process, then you cannot just send them back to their cell and say, oh, okay, well, you've done that. Thank you very much for opening up. Thank you for listening, and you've taken responsibility. But there's an element of, that guilt and shame that has to be worked through, because you can't just leave somebody to hold that. So it's about saying, you don't want to leave people feeling. So it has to be a really well managed process.
Yeah, I was saying that because I imagine here, as it happens in Portugal, there are very huge gaps in people's access to mental health care and psychotherapy. So sometimes the system finds these loopholes to put in another approach that are supposed to be holistic, not just restorative justice or psychotherapy. Right? Yeah.
And you said sort of about, goods, and I think that actually it can be used for any offence. And some people say, well, there's no victim, but we can argue that there is that there is no such thing as a victimless crime. And when I sat and observed the sycamore tree, so that's the victim awareness course based on restorative approaches in HMP Winchester, some of the prisoners, and most of them are doing at least 10 years for serious offences, and one prisoner said to me, when the question was asked about, well, who is your victim? Well, there are no victims. I just got caught allowing a load of Class A drugs to come in through at the docks. No harm. Interestingly, a couple of weeks later, after another couple, it's a weekly session, a 6-week programme, he actually realised that there were victims, that the victims were those people that were dealing drugs, that were so dependent on drugs that they would do anything in terms of prostitution, stealing. And so that ripple effect that an offence has on the wider community. And he actually was able to see that. And he was also able to see that the victims were also his family. That because of his offending, he was now serving a 10-year custodial sentence, and the impact that had on his family was absolutely huge. So it's just being able to see it through a different perspective, and that takes time. That's what I'm saying. You can't just say to an offender, "Hey," or to a victim, "Hey, do you want to meet with the person that mugged you last week?" Then most people would be like, "No, I don't." Or some people will say, "Yes, I bloody do. Get me in there with him," as I said earlier. But if you say, "Do you have any questions? Is there anything that, what do you need? What are your needs?" So it's about making sure that restorative justice allows us to meet victims' needs, and actually, at the same time, we can address those needs actually of offenders. So they say it's not one or the other.
Do you believe that is going to be the system? So is restorative justice going to become, or should restorative justice become the only resource, like mandatory restorative justice?
I don't think that it should be a mandatory process, because part of its uniqueness and part of the magic of it is actually that it is a voluntary process. You can't get people into a room if they do not want to be there.
Could be cruel to
it can re-victimise victims. And that's what it's around the preparation, that victim knows that person is going to come in the room and they are not going to apologise for what they've done to you, or they actually still believe that what they did wasn't wrong. But what I would like to see is that actually victims are offered it at every stage of the criminal justice system, as they should, that it is built into a clear processes, that it isn't just left up to individual criminal justice professionals to make that offer. And that offer shouldn't just be what we class as an opt-in offer. It should be that actually it's an opt-out. No, we are going to contact you, and we are going to, if that's okay, come and meet with you and talk to you about restorative justice, rather than being like, well, we offer restorative justice, and if you fancy doing it, then fill this form in or give us a call. And then those agencies wonder why victim participation or engagement levels are so low. They're sat there wondering why the phone doesn't ring. But also, I think, as we do here in England and Wales, in the family courts, to try and keep families out of court, they have to go to a mandatory mediation meeting. So we try to get any family issues or conflict to go to mediation. And the way that we now do that in the court process is that both parties have to go to a mandatory mediation initial assessment meeting. That's not with one another, but it's with a mediator. And then it might not go any further than that. But actually, that mandatory meeting means that person has to have a conversation about what is mediation or what is restorative justice. And then it can come back, because actually we have the legislation there. We can defer sentencing. A judge can defer sentencing for a restorative justice process to take place. It never happens. Why does it not happen? Because actually we've got cases now that are taking up to 2 years or more. If it's a serious offence, such as a sexual offence or rape, they can take up to 3 or 4 years to go through court. What does that do to the victim? Whereas actually you could be doing restorative work or an intervention leading up to that. You may then get to that point where they say, actually, that's fine, I'm okay. But you're doing more harm by just leaving people without any restorative work being done.
I want to ask you one last question we always ask. Do you believe in a world without prisons?
Am I an abolitionist? I suppose I would say I'm close to it, because actually prison doesn't work. And so much research is done, so much money is ploughed into trying to make the prison system work. Doesn't rehabilitate offenders. But I do believe that there are some prisoners who do need to be, for the very, very serious offences, but I think it is used far too much. We have a huge number of prisoners that are serving sentences for 12 months and under. How can you do any rehabilitation work with somebody in 3 months or 6 months? What you're doing is you're actually ruining those individuals' lives, when actually they could do with community sentences that really support that individual to address their offending behaviour, so that you can give them the tools and the mechanisms that they can desist and that they can change their lives around. Because putting somebody into prison for a non-violent offence does nothing but harm that individual and wider society, because it has a ripple effect on the number of families that we have in this country who have a parent that is serving a custodial sentence. The impact that has on those children, and we know that they are then more likely to get involved in criminality themselves. So we have this vicious cycle when actually we could do something completely different. But we're so driven by this view that we need to be punitive, and that somehow we believe that the public want us to be more punitive. So let's build another 20,000 prison places here in England and Wales, because that solved the problem. Oh, and actually, if somebody commits a serious crime, we give them another 10 years. So do you really think that when somebody is carrying out a knife crime, that in their head they're thinking, oh, I'm going to get an extra 10 years for this crime than what I was going to do? No, I'm going to serve 25 years. That's not going through their head. So I don't think that...
Dissuasive works.
No, being punitive does not work. Actually, what we need to do is to take that real preventative approach that deals with the structural inequalities that we have. We have high levels of social inequality. We have swathes of young people that are disengaged, that have no hope, that actually live in poverty and feel that the only way that they can get status or that they can achieve anything or keep a roof over their heads is by being involved in criminal activities. So we, I think, as the state, I say the word we, but we have a responsibility to make sure that we address those social inequalities and that everybody has opportunity.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Esta entrevista foi preparada por mim, Margarida David Cardoso, com a edição do Nuno Viegas. O som é do Bernardo Afonso. Fazem ainda parte da equipa Fumaça Fred Rocha, Joana Teresa Batista, Lucas Grimo de Freitas, Luís Marquês, Maria Almeida e Ricardo Esteves Ribeiro. Se queres contribuir para que o Fumaça continue a existir e um dia esta série sobre o sistema prisional veja a luz do dia, vai a fumaca.pt/contribuir e dá o que puderes. Essas doações pagam mais de 40% do nosso orçamento. O resto este ano é coberto por bolsas da Fred e da Limelight Foundation. Os contratos estão em fumaca.pt/transparência. Até já!